Welcome to Fireside History, where the past comes to life. If you enjoy this retelling, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to hear more. The Battle of Gallipoli, 1915. World War I. The sea was calm that night. The moon hung low, its pale light casting a silvery shimmer over the Aegean. Somewhere beyond the horizon, ships drifted silently forward, bloated with men, equipment, and 1,000 unspoken prayers. Beneath the decks, young soldiers whispered in the dark, their kit straps creaking with every breath of ocean swell. This wasn't France. This wasn't Belgium. This was something else entirely. Strange hills, a foreign tongue, the promise of glory, and the stench of death, all waiting for them, on the shores of Gallipoli. In early 1915, the Great War was stagnating. On the Western Front, a brutal stalemate of mud, wire, and machine gun fire had taken hold. Months of bloodshed had yielded little ground. Politicians and generals, desperate for movement, turned their eyes to the east, to the Ottoman Empire. The plan was audacious. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, believed that a decisive strike could knock the Ottomans out of the war entirely. A naval assault through the Dardanelles Strait, followed by a landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula, would open a new front, threaten Constantinople, and bring much-needed relief to Russian allies in the Caucasus. But this wasn't a theatre prepared for. Intelligence was patchy, maps were outdated, terrain knowledge was near non-existent, and the enemy, the Ottoman forces, were underestimated from the outset. Still, the Allies pressed forward. On the 18th of March, 1915, the first blow came. British and French battleships surged into the Dardanelles. The strait, a narrow artery of sea, connecting the Aegean to the Sea of Marmara, became a cauldron of fire and steel. Mines, some laid just days earlier by a daring Ottoman mine-layer, the Nusret, tore through the naval armada. 3 battleships were sunk. Hundreds of sailors died screaming in the cold water, twisted beneath collapsing decks and boiling steam pipes. It was a humiliating blow, and it changed the strategy overnight. A land invasion was now deemed necessary, and so Gallipoli became the chosen ground. Troops from across the British Empire assembled: British regulars, French colonial units, Indian mountain batteries, and from the far corners of the world, the ANZACs, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. For many of these men, Gallipoli was to be their first real taste of war. They trained in Egypt, drilled under the desert sun, and rehearsed amphibious landings with vague maps and uncertain plans. Spirits were high, letters home brimmed with confidence, but there was an undercurrent of unease. Some officers warned of poor coordination, others questioned the intelligence of the landings, and as April drew near, the clock ticked steadily toward disaster. The invasion began before dawn. British troops landed at Cape Helles in the south. French forces struck at Cumcail across the straits. But the heart of the story, the part etched deepest in memory, was ANZAC Cove. Just before 5 a.m, the first waves of Australians crept toward the dark outline of the shore. They had expected flat beaches and easy ground. What they found instead were steep ridges, tangled scrub and hidden machine gun nests. Private Arthur Blackburn of the 10th Battalion later recalled the confusion. We were told the beach was open, but as we leapt from the boats, bullets cut the air like angry bees. Men were falling before they hit the water. The sea turned pink within minutes. The landings were chaotic. Rowboats grounded on the wrong beaches. Units became separated. Officers were killed within moments of landing, but somehow, amid the madness, they held. Bayonets gleamed in the rising sun. The bark of Lee Enfield rifles cracked through the cliffs. Grenades, or bombs as they were called then, thumped through the gullies with deafening force. Men fought tooth and nail to take the first ridges, hauling themselves uphill under rifle fire and falling shrapnel. By midday, the ANZACs had dug in. Narrow trenches clawed into the hillside. Casualties were appalling. At least 2,000 Allied men were killed or wounded in those first hours alone. Turkish losses were just as heavy, if not worse. And yet, neither side would yield. To the north, a 34-year-old Turkish lieutenant colonel, Mustafa Kemal, took decisive action. Against orders, he rushed the 57th Infantry Regiment to plug the gap forming in the ridge lines above the ANZAC beachhead. His message to his men would become legendary. "I do not order you to fight, I order you to die." And they did. The 57th was virtually wiped out, but they stopped the advance cold. That single decision, made under extreme pressure and without waiting for approval, changed the battle. Had Kemal hesitated, the Allies might have seized the heights. Instead, they became trapped, below steep, narrow ridges, in shallow trenches under constant fire. Gallipoli was not like the fields of Flanders. The terrain was alien, dry, rocky, and unforgiving. The trenches were narrow, shallow, and often hastily dug. Men huddled under scraps of canvas or open sky, choked by dust and flies, assaulted by lice and the relentless Mediterranean sun. Water was scarce. Food was worse. Cans of bully beef boiled in the heat, swarming with insects. Dysentery swept through the ranks like wildfire. In some units, half the men were sick at any given time, and still, the guns never stopped. Every day brought sniper fire, artillery bombardments, and sudden, savage raids. Men learned to keep low, to crawl, not walk, to urinate over the top of their trench, rather than risk exposure. Shell shock, not yet fully understood, began to take hold. A Turkish shell, later nicknamed Beachy Bill, became infamous. Fired from a concealed battery, it harassed ANZAC Cove endlessly. Men could hear its whine moments before impact, and they learned quickly. The ones who didn't often never got up again. Yet, in spite of it all, camaraderie blossomed. Letters home told of strange friendships, of cigarette exchanges with Turkish soldiers during momentary truces, of poetry scribbled in margins, of humour found even in horror. One digger, Thomas O'Hara, wrote, "We bury them, they bury us. No hatred here, just poor buggers doing their job." The human spirit clung to life in that rocky soil, even as generals pressed for new offensives, and more men were thrown into the grinder. By midsummer, the lines had barely shifted. The British command knew something had to change. And so, in August, they launched a final push, a desperate attempt to break the stalemate. Fresh landings at Suvla Bay, renewed attacks from ANZAC lines, and a push for the peaks of Sari Bair. The terrain again would prove a cruel master. Men were expected to scale ridges at night, carrying full kit, rifles, and limited water. They stumbled in the dark, misread orders, and became lost in gullies with names like The Neck, Rhododendron Spur, and Dead Man's Ridge. At the Neck, the 3rd Light Horse Brigade charged in 4 waves as against machine guns over open ground. In less than 5 minutes, over 230 men fell. Most never reached the Ottoman line. Some were shot as they left the trench. The attack, already questioned by officers on the ground, went ahead regardless, a grim echo of the incompetence that plagued the campaign. One survivor later wrote, "I saw our boys mown down like wheat. Not one Turk was touched. It wasn't war. It was murder." The flies came quickly. Black clouds of them, thick enough to darken the air, rising from the unburied dead that carpeted no man's land. bodies that had lain there for days, weeks even, swollen in the heat, eyes crusted shut, skin peeling in the sun. Men had to eat with one hand while swatting them with the other. They stuffed handkerchiefs into their mouths just to chew without vomiting. The smell. It soaked into the uniform, the blankets, the skin itself. There was no escape from it. It became part of them, and still, the fighting went on. In early August, the Allied command threw its last dice. The grand August offensive, and a desperate bid to break the stalemate and seize the heights above ANZAC Cove, was already unravelling by the time the first shots were fired. The British had landed at Suvla Bay under the cover of night. It should have been a masterstroke. Fresh troops, open beaches, high ground within reach. But hesitation cost them everything. Their commander, Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Stopford, remained aboard ship during the landings. Unfamiliar with modern warfare and paralysed by uncertainty, he delayed ordering the advance until it was too late. The Ottoman defenders, stunned at first, rallied with furious speed. And the high ground, Chunuk Bair, Hill 971, and the Sari Bair Ridge remained firmly in Turkish hands. While the Suvla troops lingered, exhausted ANZAC units launched uphill assaults into a hell of rock and fire. At Chunuk Bair, the New Zealanders fought like demons. Over 2 blood-soaked days, they stormed the ridgelines, bayonets fixed, voices hoarse from shouting. Men like Lieutenant Colonel William Malone of the Wellington Battalion, meticulous, proud and fiercely protective of his soldiers, led from the front. Malone refused a suicidal daytime assault and instead ordered his men forward under the cloak of night. They reached the summit, they held it, but they were alone. The promised reinforcements never came. For 2 days they faced ceaseless Turkish counterattacks, artillery barrages, and creeping suffocation from the mounting heat. Water ran out. Ammunition dwindled. Men drank their own urine. Others crawled from the trenches, delirious with thirst only to be gunned down. Malone was killed by friendly fire, a British shell that dropped short. By the end of it, only a handful of survivors remained, barely able to lift their rifles. Chunuk Bair was lost, and with it, the last real hope of breaking through. At the neck, a narrow strip of land, no wider than a tennis court, the Australians were ordered to charge again. 4 waves of the 8th and 10th Light Horse Regiments. None came back intact. It was meant to be a diversion, part of a larger push. But coordination failed. Artillery support was mistimed. The Turkish defenders, dug in, well-armed, waiting, simply cut them down. Wave after wave. Some men didn't even make it 10 steps. Others reached the wire and found it uncut, curling, barbed and lethal. They died, clawing at it, crying out for their mates, choking on their own blood. Lieutenant Colonel Noel Brazier, who watched it unfold, later wrote, "It was sheer, bloody madness, and still we sent them. I begged them to call it off. I was told it had to go ahead. It was already in the orders." The battlefield was littered with bodies, young Australians piled 2 and 3 deep. Some were still alive. One soldier lay half-buried, arms stretched skyward, clutching a photograph in his hand. A girl, smiling. The fighting paused just long enough for the Turks to call out, offering a brief truce to retrieve the wounded. It was refused, and the wounded died where they lay. By September, Gallipoli had become a prison of sorts, a haunted peninsula locked in a kind of living death. No side could advance. No side would retreat. The trenches were often no more than 20 yards apart. You could hear the enemy breathe, hear the clink of cutlery, the rasp of coughing, the whispered prayers in another language. Every movement invited a bullet. The Australians called out jokes across the lines. The Turks sometimes replied. But when the whistles blew, all humanity vanished. Snipers ruled the hours between dusk and dawn. A man might lift his head a moment too long and never lower it again. A glint of metal was all it took, a reflection from a belt buckle, a watch face, a sheen of sweat, and then the crack of a Mauser, the thump of a body. Silence. Artillery, when it came, was random and merciless. Some shells buried themselves in the dirt before detonating. Others sprayed rock fragments and jagged steel in all directions. The shrapnel didn't cut. It tore. It smashed. It gouged out eyes and shattered spines. And through it all, the monotony, the maddening routine of war. Stand to, breakfast, parade, trench maintenance, ration collection, shelling, stand to again. A letter from home, a rumour, another name read out at roll call. The chaplain murmuring over a fresh grave, dug beside the latrines. Some men turned inwards, becoming silent, unreachable. Others lashed out, picked fights, drank anything flammable, wept without warning. Shell shock was whispered about, not fully understood, often seen as cowardice. But it was everywhere. In the 1,000-yard stares, in the trembling hands, in the dreams filled with sand and screams. There were moments of respite. Some nights the guns fell silent. The stars emerged. Men would stare up and remember the softness of home, the smell of eucalyptus, the curve of a lover's neck, the quiet back streets of Christchurch, or Ballarat or Walthamstow, and they would cry. Not from fear, but from the weight of it all. By the end of autumn it was clear to many in Britain that the Gallipoli campaign had failed. But politics is a slow beast. Reports were sanitised, maps redrawn to look more promising, letters from the front, heavily censored, hid the worst of the rot. But the numbers could not be ignored forever. Tens of thousands wounded, thousands dead, no breakthrough, no progress, no end in sight. Churchill, once the architect of the campaign, found himself isolated. His colleagues turned cold. The press grew sceptical. And soon, very soon, the questions began in Parliament. The Ottoman Empire, supposedly the sick man of Europe, had not collapsed. Far from it. Its army had held one of the most powerful empires in history at bay, on terrain of its choosing, in a war of attrition it could sustain. And worse, winter was coming. In late November, a storm swept across the peninsula. It began with driving rain, relentless sheets of it, hammering the trenches, flooding dugouts, turning the dry gullies into rivers of mud and filth. Then came the cold. Temperatures plunged. Men woke to frost caked on their beards, their boots frozen solid to the trench floor. Water tins cracked, rifles jammed, fingers turned black with frostbite. In the lowlands near Suvla, entire sections of trench collapsed underwater, men drowned in their sleep, smothered in the mud. In a single week, over 5,000 Allied troops were admitted to field hospitals for cold-related injuries. Some never made it back. Others returned missing toes, or legs, or half their faces, their features eaten away by exposure. One Scottish stretcher-bearer described the scene as not war, but a cruel, bitter punishment, a place God turned away from. Even the Turks suffered. Their trenches higher up were exposed to the wind. Supplies ran thin. Medical aid was scarce. And yet they endured. Barefoot conscripts wrapped their feet in rags and waited out the storm. Hungry, shivering, unbroken, both sides were now simply trying to survive. Victory had become irrelevant. No ridge was worth another life. No bayonet charge would shift the line. The dead far outnumbered the ground gained. And the wounded, many of them forgotten, many without names, would never walk properly again. By December, the orders had been signed. The evacuation would begin. Silent, careful, and under the noses of the enemy. But how do you withdraw tens of thousands of men under fire without tipping your hand? It began not with fanfare or drumbeat, but with silence. In the dead of night, the fires were left to burn, carefully arranged, flickering as if men still crouched beside them. Rifles, propped on tripwires, were rigged to fire at random intervals, mimicking sentries still on watch. And behind the lines, boots moved cautiously over duckboards, breath held tight, hearts pounding. The evacuation of Gallipoli was underway. It was December 1915. After months of agony, command had finally conceded what many soldiers had known for weeks. The campaign had failed. There would be no breakthrough, no glorious march on Constantinople, only the grim reality of retreat. And yet, paradoxically, it would be the most successful phase of the entire operation. The first to go were the wounded and sick, thousands of them. Then the heavy equipment, horses, ammunition stockpiles, all under the cloak of darkness and strict radio silence. Every night a few more men would slip down to the beach, ferried to waiting trawlers under moonlight. Every morning the trenches were manned by fewer soldiers. By late December only a skeleton force remained, tasked with holding the line and keeping up the illusion. At ANZAC Cove, an eerie quiet had settled. The Turks, too, seemed to sense something was changing. Patrols grew more frequent. Shells fell closer to the beach. But still, they hesitated. Whether through caution or respect, they did not press. And then, on the night of January 8th, 1916, the final withdrawal. The last men crept from the trenches, boots muffled in Hessian, bayonets sheathed. They left behind decoys, rifles set to discharge hours after they'd gone, collapsing water drums to mimic footsteps. Not a single man was lost in that final act. Not one casualty during the evacuation. It was a rare, bitter triumph, carried out not through command brilliance, but by the discipline, ingenuity, and sheer courage of men long abandoned by strategy. Gallipoli was over. But the echoes of what happened there would linger for generations. In just 8 months of fighting, the Gallipoli campaign claimed over 500,000 casualties. For the Allies, more than 44,000 dead. British, French, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, Newfoundlanders. Another 97,000 wounded or sick. For the Ottomans, some 87,000 killed, 165,000 wounded. Many were peasants who had never travelled beyond their village until they found themselves on that rocky, blood-soaked peninsula. The terrain remains marked by bones. Even today, a storm or a landslide can reveal them, bleached fragments of femurs or skulls poking through the clay, soldiers who never left, known only to the hills. The campaign had achieved nothing strategically. The Dardanelles remained closed. The Ottomans held their ground, and the Western Front, far from relieved, would grind on for 3 more years. But in a cruel twist of fate, Gallipoli's true legacy was not military. It was human. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli was a baptism of fire. Before 1915, they were dominions, far-flung territories of the British Empire, their soldiers largely anonymous within it. But Gallipoli changed that. It wasn't just the blood, it was the bravery, the sacrifice, the camaraderie, the sheer endurance of those men, many of them volunteers, barely trained, who carved their identity into those ridgelines with bayonets and boots and the grit of their dying breath. The word ANZAC became sacred. It stood for something more than military abbreviation. It stood for courage under fire, for loyalty, for the refusal to give up, even when the orders made no sense and the outcome was already doomed. Each year on the 25th of April, dawn services are held from Gallipoli shores to suburban parks, mountain fields to small town cenotaphs. Not to celebrate war, but to remember it, to honour the ordinary men who were asked to do the impossible and went anyway. In Turkey too, Gallipoli carries a deep national weight. Mustafa Kemal, the young commander who rallied the Ottoman lines and stopped the Allies in their tracks, would later become Ataturk, founder of modern Turkey. He spoke not of hatred, but of peace. In 1934 he offered these words to the families of the fallen. Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. Therefore rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mehmets to us where they lie side by side. In that soil, a shared pain, a shared memory, and perhaps a shared hope that such slaughter need never happen again. Private George Simons of the 5th Battalion, writing weeks after the evacuation, put it plainly. We came here thinking we'd be men. I don't know what we are now. Men, maybe, but older than we should be, and haunted by the mates we left behind. Many who returned came home broken, not just in body, but in mind. Shell shock, survivor's guilt, recurring infections, amputations, and the worst wound of all, being forgotten. For years, Gallipoli was treated as a footnote by those who had championed it, a minor theatre, a distraction from the real war in Europe. But for those who fought it, it was the centre of the universe, a furnace that melted away youth and forged something harder and far more sorrowful. Some never spoke of it again. Others spent their lives trying to explain it, through memoirs, silence, drunken nights, or folded uniforms in attic boxes. But all of them carried it, and they left behind a lesson paid for in blood. Gallipoli was a disaster, tactically, logistically, strategically, but it forced the world to reckon with the brutal realities of modern warfare, the limits of empire, the folly of hubris, and the strength of the human spirit in the face of unspeakable odds. It gave rise to national identities, to shared remembrance, to bitter reflection, and perhaps to humility, for leaders who had gambled with lives and lost, for nations who realised their independence was not just inherited, it was earned in mud and fire. And for the millions who would follow in uniform in later wars, still learning the hard lessons Gallipoli first made clear. The war would go on. The killing would escalate. But for those who lived through that brutal campaign on the Turkish shore, nothing would ever be the same. And in the soft rustle of wind across Lone Pine, or the shimmer of moonlight on ANZAC Cove, you can still feel it. A silence heavy with memory, a place that changed the world. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.